people once lived in the East, and because they were Christians, their life was hard. They were told, "Leave your God, come to love Allah and you will live better." But they kept their faith and continued to live in the name of Christ. Amid the massive quantity of correspondences in the archives of the writer Viktor Shklovsky, there is a letter from an Assyrian man, Lazar Zarvanov, a bootblack from St. Petersburg and an ex-captain of the artillery of pre-revolutionary Russia. From that simple letter you can feel the shadow of the author's and his people's arcane and tragic history. On November 18, 1924, Lazar Zarvanov wrote to Viktor Shklovsky, the first assistant to the chief of the Russian army in Persia and the Caucasus. "My dear friend Victor," he wrote, "I just bought the journal Spark and found your article. My heart was filled with joy. I remember how we worked together in Persia, in the town of Urmia. I translated your article into Assyrian and read it to my people. I will never forget you. Now every day I sit on the street corner, shining and repairing shoes. Day passes after day, and I am wasting away from distress and boredom. I'm ashamed to polish shoes, my dear Victor. Can you get me out of here? Get me a job so I can be useful? Apart from you, I don't know anybody in this city. Please do something for me. With this, I say goodbye. Your dearest friend, Lazar Zarvanov." What happened to the Assyrian people in faraway Persia and Turkey when the whole nation was scattered all over the world? These are the people that proudly call themselves Assyrians today. They honor their culture and traditions, music, singing, dancing, festivals, society. They say the word Assyrian with a special pride. The majority of these Assyrians came to Russia at the time of the First World War. It led the blood purges that the Turks and Kurds had started. These Assyrians left their homeland, often whole villages departing at once. Many of them settled in the Caucasus. Others went further north. They remained there, although the life was very difficult. They had come at a bad time. World War I, revolution, the Civil War, famine, devastation, and a new communist regime that had no mercy. Though Assyrian refugees could only rely on themselves, they got used to the hardships. If they could live for centuries surrounded by people of other religious beliefs, then here in Russia, among brothers in faith, they could be naturalized, even without knowing the Russian language or way of life. Assyrians brought with them traditions and holidays that helped them stay together until the present day, preserving their identity within the Russian society. Our family moved to Russia with the retreating Russian army. And sometime around the end of 1919s, the beginning of the 1920s, our grandparents moved to Moscow. They immediately moved into the house of the Count Vinogradov, which was then a place on the outside of central Moscow. In the 1920s, when the new economic policy was introduced, our family was, as all Assyrians were, earning their living in small trade, making candies, repairing shoes, and creating pictures from paper mache. It was all done within one clan. We came as aliens to Russia, not knowing the language or traditions, but we integrated. We had to. Although the Orthodox religion wasn't ours, we didn't have our own church. Nevertheless, we have been celebrating Assyrian holidays parallel with Russian ones ever since. All the troubles that the Russian people went through, the Assyrians had to go through as well. There was Stalin's repression, when, for instance, one big clan which had 40 men in it was left without a single one. Our great-grandfathers were persecuted and sent to Siberia. My grandfather had been sent back to Iran. Our uncle had been charged and was sent to slave labor in the north. In just 1 year, there were only women left in the families. The repressions passed, and then all the remaining men went to fight in the Second World War. Many died, but some of our greatest fighters are our pride, combat generals, and some received the highest honors of the Soviet Union, the Medal of the Hero of the Soviet Union. But our holidays, Assyrian holidays, were celebrated still every year. October 1st and 2nd remained festival time for our people, despite social distress and war. There was a building on number 3, the 3rd Samatyok Street, on the outskirts of Moscow, where Count Vinogradov's house was located. Everybody knew this place in Moscow, because the Assyrians always got together over there. And not only the Assyrians, but a lot of Russians came as well. There were always lots of interesting people over there. That was a wonderful place where anybody and everybody was welcome. For instance, my grandmother laid out a barrel of red cabbage on the festival days, and anyone could come and grab some food. The doors were always open. At the Durana, we usually had 30 to 40 sheep to prepare. The trams were stopped, and people came out to watch. They didn't quite understand what we were doing, butchering sheep in the center of Moscow, and listening to strange music. Usually there was a drum and zurna playing. That was very surprising to the Russians, but in a while the whole city knew the place. We sometimes celebrated for a couple nights in a row. But in 1988 we lost the place. Now it's an office building. Too bad we couldn't save it. The Syrians themselves built that house. Before the revolution, it was a French match factory, 1 story high. And then, with the permission of Lenin's wife, Nadezhda Krupskaya, the Syrians built 3 more stories on top. During Perestroika, we lost the building, but there is now hope, as now there is a building of the Assyrian church being completed. And hopefully that will serve as a place to get together to celebrate our holidays. I think it will have an important role in uniting the Assyrian people, so that our kids can grow up understanding the traditions of our nation, knowing the language and the history of our people. And most importantly, knowing the religion that saved us from extinction when we lived surrounded by the Muslim nations. Only Christianity saved our people from assimilation.
Знали уже полностью историю Ассирии и история религии Ассирии, которая, я считаю, спасла ассирийский народ, который остался в окружении мусульман, чуждого мира.
This church is our new hope and our next hope. It is our past, our present, and most importantly, our future. The building of the first Assyrian church in Russia will be a blissful moment for all Assyrians. Soon anybody and everybody will be able to return to the fold of their original church. It is already clear that the church will consolidate the faith of Assyrians in Moscow and Russians in the name of a God that is universal for all Assyrians, in the name of Christ. What of the history of the Assyrian people after the breakup of the Roman Empire and the final fall of Babylon, and the living conditions that came with it? Asks Sergei Osipov, the head editor of the journal The Word. It certainly influenced the people's choice in accepting a new ideology, Christianity. Many facts that have to do with the early history of the propagation of Christ's doctrines are not well known, have either been forgotten or scantily recorded. But what are the facts? As everybody well knows, the Bible was originally written in the Aramaic language, and that Father Abraham originally is from Ur, one of the centers of the Assyrian Babylonian civilization. It has been calculated that Assyrians are referred to in the Bible around 150 times, and that such renowned figures as the prophets Daniel and Isaiah lived on the territory of the Assyrian Empire. There are indisputable facts that among the first of Christ's followers were many Aramaic speakers or people of Assyrian origin. Here's the Assyrian Empire as it looked back then. As the Assyrian Empire broke up, a few small states appeared. Among these is the kingdom of Edessa. King Nimrud had founded the city of Orhe in the south, in eastern Turkey, which was renamed Edessa. Later, in the 115th year after the birth of Christ, Mesopotamia was conquered by the Roman Emperor Trajan, who divided that region into a southern and northern part that were then called Assyria. This territory included the Edessa kingdom. In the historic commentaries of Markova Pomazonsky, dated from the 15th century, it was said that Edessa was not just famous for its cathedrals and hermits, but also for being the first state that officially was converted to the Christian faith. In the history of Edessa, King Abgar Akama is very well known. Many archaeological sites, including those excavated by Segal, have proved one of the legends about the correspondence between King Abgar and Jesus Christ himself. Because of that connection, Jesus sent one of his students, the apostle Mar Shimon, to Edessa. After the crucifixion and resurrection of Christ, Mar Shimon was one of the apostles that brought Christianity to the east, that is, to Asia. His followers and one of the 70 students of Christ was Mar Adai, or Thaddeus, or in Russian known as Fadei, who together with Mar Shimon brought Christianity to Edessa. already in the first years following the crucifixion.
Ученики Христа, Мараддай и Мартума, принесли христианство уже в первые же годы после.
There is a hypothesis that these saints cured King Abgar, who together with the whole nation converted to the Christian faith. Evidence shows that this happened in the 45th year after the death of Christ, 300 years before Rome became Christian itself. In addition to that, Assyrian priests and monks were worldly renowned missionaries. Through their fearlessness and determination, these immortal men spread Christianity from Spain to the Japanese islands. Many of them died in the process. As one of the Assyrian church hierarchy wrote, these missionaries were unpretentious saints, kind-hearted, and as brave as lions. They carried the light of Christianity, sacrificing their lives. Here we should mention that the ethnic confessional segregation of Assyrians started from the Kolchidon Synod in the 5th century AD. The influence of Parthia and Byzantium produced the division of the Church of the East into various sects. These sects included the Monophysites, the so-called Nestorians, the Orthodox, and many others. Due to this, nowadays, the Assyrians are referred to as Chaldeans, Assyro-Chaldeans, Jacobites, Nestorians.
Надо отметить еще то, что этот процесс не остановился в V веке, а
Since the 5th century, there have been crusades and the persecution of the Assyrians by the Ottoman Turks that forced the Assyrian people into segregation. И в силу этого многие ассирийцы, стараясь сохранить свою первооснову своей религии, они Many tribes had migrated to inaccessible places.
Такое конфессиональное разделение, оно и стало причиной разделения
Due to this segregation,
народа на многие
there resulted the splitting and dissemination of our nation. In the 14th century, the history of the Assyrian people took an abrupt turn. Tamerlane inspired massive persecution of the Christians in the East. The patriarch of the Assyrian Church was forced to leave with all his people to Mosul in northern Iran. This became the Assyrian homeland for centuries. There were occasional travelers that managed to reach these inaccessible mountains, where Assyrians had lived in exclusion for over 100 years. It was written in scientific magazines and secret intelligence reports. Assyrians, the remainder of the people that used to populate the whole territory of Assyria, remain in small numbers between the Mosul and Jewel American and neighboring countries to the west, out to Sirt and to Lake Urmia to the east. At one time they used to be a majority of the local population, but gradually they drifted apart and left for other countries. There are only a few left among the Kurds. They kept their ancient culture, and unlike the Kurds, they lived in good houses, spacious and clean. The women have full freedom at home. They have become less hostile over time, living in exclusion. They are brave and enterprising and capable of learning. They are easily able to adapt themselves to European cultures and languages. Assyrians suffered much for the religion, for which they are very attached to. All the rituals and ceremonies are accurately followed. The cross is the only image. They have great respect for it. There are no icons. They dress in clothes often with crosses on them. They are fanatical, especially in the mountains. Missionaries are not looked upon favorably. Beginning from the end of the 16th century, missionaries of different denominations from Europe and later from America became very active among the Assyrians of the Ottoman Empire. Victor Shklovsky recalled, all of them were hunting for the souls of the Christian Assyrians. First of all, they came for political reasons, to establish an influence in the region. Many Assyrians of Persia placed themselves under the wing of Protestantism, the Anglican Church, or Uniate missions in order to save their families. Only Asherite Assyrians kept close to the original faith. The political situation in Mesopotamia played a leading role in the appearance of the missionaries of various denominations amongst the Assyrian people. They unfortunately took advantage of the fact that Assyrians were in a very bad state, suffering from cold, hunger, and poor living conditions. The missionaries helped only those who were willing to convert to their faith, basically Christianizing the Christians. This is certainly a sad fact. Due to this difficult time in Assyrian history, the missionaries succeeded in converting masses of Assyrian people. They thought of the Assyrians as heretics, even though the Assyrian faith was older by some hundreds of years and undoubtedly closer to the origins of Christian doctrine. The Russian Orthodox Church was one of the last denominations to open its missions in Urmia at the end of the last century. Nevertheless, Assyrians were drawn especially to the Russian Orthodox Church and Russia in general as they saw in Russians fellow believers. In the beginning of the 19th century, Russia won from the Persians and Turks the main part of Armenia and Georgia. Thereafter, Russia came into immediate contact with the Syrians, who immediately took Russia's side. Assyrians were always trying to get away from the antagonistic Muslim surroundings and saw Russians as their only hope. Mikhail Sado, professor of the St. Petersburg Spiritual Academy. Assyrian Christians helped the Russians, serving as guides, providing the Russian army with forage for their horses and food beginning from the 18th century. And as a result, 100 Syrian families were granted the right to live in Russia and in the Caucasus autonomies. Therefore, Assyrian villages that appeared in Russia were located mostly on the borders with Iran and Turkey. And from that moment on, some Assyrians even became official citizens of the Russian Empire. Especially as Russia, from the middle of the 19th century, had changed its orientation from west to east, Christians were to be the first allies in Russia's advance towards the Caucasus and the Middle East. Through the rest of the 19th century, Assyrians of Urmia were endlessly trying to become integrated with Russian Orthodox Church. However, Russia didn't want to break relations with Turkey for strategic reasons. Nonetheless, at the end of the 19th century, some of the Assyrian people were officially united with Russian Orthodoxy. In 1918, in St. Petersburg, the Act of Unification was signed, allowing for some Assyrians of Persia to be united to the Russian Orthodox Church. On March 25, 1898, in the Troitsky Cathedral in St. Petersburg, a delegation of Syro-Chaldeans, headed by the Supreme Bishop Mar Shimon, met with the representatives of the Russian Orthodox Church to unite their congregation with Russian Orthodoxy. At 9:30 a.m. on that fateful day, the head of the Russian Church entered into the cathedral with the Assyrian bishop.
митрополит Палладий,
the head of the Russian church, then asked him, "Are you ready to choose the Orthodox faith?" And the bishop replied, "Yes, we are."
Хочешь ли отречься от ереси? На что епископ ответил: хочешь.
Immediately after that, the Persian town of Urmia was opened to an Orthodox mission. Thousands of Assyrians were taught in the mission schools. By 1914, the Assyrian Orthodox community was by far the biggest in the region. Even the militant mountain Assyrians, headed by the Patriarch, gave their approval to assimilate. They were forced into allegiance, as they felt that this was a good way to prevent their immediate genocide from the Turks. Here we are again, in the year 1914, that fateful year for the Assyrians. Once again, history had tried to test that long-suffering nation, and once again they survived these bloody and often merciless times. The people have long learned to withstand hardships. Maybe only time is powerful enough to break their spirit and wipe out a people. In just time, Assyrians have lived on the earth for a very long time. Just think how ancient this nation is. It was a time when the first human civilizations were being born. When the Sumerian and Akkad empires just came into existence. People came from the North Flood and created Assyria on the north and Babylon on the south. Again, hundreds of years passed. Assyria had formed itself into a strong state. Across the lands, the word spread that Assyrians were the most brave and fearless warriors. A power that nobody could match. At the peak of its power, territory of the Assyrian Empire spread from Egypt to the Mediterranean and Black Sea, and from the Caucasus to northern India. But every success story has an end. Unable to control such a massive empire, endless warfare had exhausted and weakened Assyria. In the year 1612 BC, Nineveh fell victim to a temporary alliance between the Babylonians and the Medians. Assyrians lost their state and were unable to recover. There was nothing to prevent Assyrians from being dissolved into the different peoples of the various nations of history. There would have been nothing left of them if not for the Christian faith that separated them from the surrounding nations. Assyrians have a great respect for their ancestors and relatives. In their houses, you can see pictures of parents and grandparents in the most visible places. They all can show you, of course, a special photo of the young man in the priest cassock with the big crest on his chest. That man is the honorable member of every Assyrian family. Since ancient times, Assyrians lived in clans that joined into the Asherites, headed by the Malik. They all complied with the Patriarch. Since the 16th century, the right to be the leader of the nation belonged to the one clan, as legend had it, that made its beginnings from Saint Simon, Christ's brother. In 1903, 17-year-old Mar Shimon Benjamin was chosen to be the patriarch of the Assyrians. He was the one to take his people through all the hardships that the Assyrian nation had suffered since the beginning of the 20th century. The Turks never before involved themselves in the life of the mountain Assyrians. They only collected very nominal taxes. However, when power passed to the radical young Turkish party that had started the pan-Turkish policy of unification of all the Turkish people under the aegis of Turkey, this resulted in the displacement of all the Christian nations, their extermination or forced assimilation. I am not going to tolerate any more Christians in Turkey, Ministry of Foreign Affairs Enver Pasha declared. The Turks began a plan of genocide towards the Assyrians. There were increasing tensions on the Russian borders with Turkey and Iran. The Russian government had started negotiations with Patriarch Mar Shimon for Assyrian assistance in case of Russian war with Turkey. The Patriarch had promised a 40,000-man army. The Turks soon reacted by provoking the massacre of the Assyrians by the Kurds. The situation became critical. If immediate action wasn't taken, the mass of the Assyrian population would have been wiped out, as was reported by the Russian consul to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in the year 1908. In August of 1914, Germany declared war on Russia. And it was clear that Turkey, as Germany's ally, would enter the war shortly after. Russians again had activated negotiations with Mar Shimon. Turkey, in return, declared the conscription of Assyrians into the Turkish army. Many Assyrians were now leaving for Russia and Persia. The Turkish government had concentrated its forces on the Russian border and started to arm the Kurds, provoking them against their Christian neighbors. On October 29, 1914, a Turkish and German fleet entered Russian territorial waters. A Russian gunboat was sunk, and Edessa, Sevastopol, and other cities were bombarded. That was an actual declaration of war from the Turks. Active warfare on the land and sea had begun. The Russian command had initiated contact with the Patriarch, calling Assyrians to revolt against the Turks. Outnumbered Assyrians were already fighting Turks and Kurds, who were pressing the Assyrians to the mountains far from the Russian-Turkish front line. The Patriarch was asking for weapons and ammunition from the Russians. The Turks, in return, imprisoned the Patriarch's brother and family. Your brother will stay alive if Assyrians will stop negotiations with Russians and keep quiet, Turkish authorities declared. The Patriarch replied, I am the leader of my people. I can't betray the nation for one person, even if he is my brother. Hormuzd was executed together with the other members of the Patriarch's family. The weapons that Russians promised didn't come. Turkish forces pushed Assyrians high up into the mountains, and the whole nation was on the verge of extermination. The Patriarch wrote letter after letter to the Russian High Command. I'm informing you that for more than a month already my people have been fighting in the mountains against Kurdish and Turkish forces. Turks have occupied our villages and burned them all. The Assyrians have fled into the mountains and are dying from starvation. Ammunition has run out. We are surrounded by enemies. Our situation is desperate and hopeless. I am begging you to send troops here, in the name of Christ. Finally, 400 Cossacks were sent from Persia, but they were ambushed and wiped out by the Kurds. There was no help for the Assyrians to rely on. In this critical moment, the Patriarch decided to accept the Russians' offer to fight the Turks towards Persia, towards the Russian army. That heroic journey of several 100,000 Assyrians, women and children, in continuous warfare on the snowy mountains lasted a whole month. Countless numbers of them failed to get through. On September 15, 1915, the Assyrians joined up with the Russians in the valley of Lake Urmia. The Russian High Command expressed its admiration for the Assyrians. In December 1915, the Patriarch was invited to the capital of Georgia, Tbilisi, to meet with the Emperor's brother, Grand Prince Nikolai Nikolaevich, chief of the Russian military mission in the Caucasus. Mar Shimon was given a personal train, and he left for the meeting. It was a long way across Armenia and Georgia. Every place the train passed, the Patriarch was saluted by masses of people. The whole road was decorated by flags and ribbons. The Grand Prince decorated the Patriarch with a medal and declared the Assyrians as official allies. They organized Assyrian battalions within the Russian army, and he promised not to pull out troops from Persia. The Patriarch exchanged telegrams with the Russian Emperor. By 1917, Turkey was clearly losing the war and was on the edge of capitulation. In the preliminary agreement between the Russian allies, France, England, and the United States, Russia was supposed to receive the territory of Turkish Armenia. The Van region, motherland of the mountain Assyrians, and also Constantinople with its bays. By then, the Russian Revolution came about, and the Russian army on the south started to disintegrate. Soon, the army had turned into a gang of bandits and marauders fleeing home to Russia. After the Socialist Revolution in December 1917, Russians had made a truce with the Germans, and all military actions had ceased. As the Turks gained time to recover, they readjusted their positions and prepared to take Iran's Azerbaijan and the Caucasus. Russian troops then hurriedly withdrew from Persia. Victor Shklovsky was an eyewitness to these events. His dates and facts may be slightly off, but his images are very vivid. And the Russian troops disappeared like water through sand, he wrote. The Russians have gone. They have left a lot of weapons. Assyrians and Armenians armed themselves and started to collect weapons from Persians. They had old scores to settle. Assyrians were walking in trousers sewn from pieces of calico. Persian women were frightened and frightened their children with tales of the Assyrians. The Assyrians had covered the Russian retreat and were left alone once again. 30,000 rifles were collected from the Persians. Then Sinko, the Kurdish Khan, said to Mar Shimon, "Come to me. I want to give up weapons too." The Patriarch took 300 men with him, got into a chariot, and went to the mountains where Khan Sinko lived. The convoy drove up into the Khan's yard, and the Patriarch walked into the house. The Kurds got up on the roofs with rifles. The Assyrians asked the Kurds, "Why are you climbing on the roofs?" "We are afraid of you," the Kurds replied. "But what are the guns for?" The Kurds were silent. Mar Shimon came out onto the doorsteps. He looked gloomy. The office instructor charged, "Mount!" Kurds fired at once like bells, ringing, and then again and again. Then a machine gun. Only a few survived. One of them was Lazar Zervandov, who afterwards found himself sitting on a street corner on Nevsky Prospect, and who also disappeared with the others in Stalin's repressions. It wasn't known then that the murder of the patriarch was provoked by the Iranian government, who didn't wish to tolerate armed Assyrians in Persia. Used by the Russians, the English, and others in their political games, they again were alone in hostile surroundings. Victor Shklovsky remembered as an eyewitness. The Kurds murdered the patriarch, a man of medium height, wearing a turban, fez, and cassock with an old cross. From the 4th century, he had a ruddy complexion, and his eyes were childlike. White teeth and gray-haired at just 30 years of age, he was an open-hearted man. When we were leaving, he asked for rifles and cannons. We left him around 40. He also wanted lieutenant's ranks for all of his meliks. Assyrians were left without their patriarch. The Turks went through the mountain passes and came to Urmia. Assyrians and Armenians, under the command of Colonel Kondratyov, beat them back once, twice, then the cannon shells ran out. More and more Turks were coming on like grasshoppers. The Assyrians had to leave. The way to Russia was blocked. Even Georgia was under the threat from the Turks. They decided to go towards the English, to Hamadan. Assyrians and Armenians of Urmia got together and left their homeland. Altogether, 250,000 people. There were Russian troops in the foreguard and Assyrians at the sides. In between them were all the masses. There were no roads, just the mountains. Turks, Kurds, and Persians were all around, embittered enemies waiting in ambush. There was fighting in the canyons, death everywhere. But they kept going, even without water. For 12 days they ate only snow. The horses were falling down. Then they took horses from the old men to give to the young ones. The Syrians had to save not just their nation, but their people. Old women had to be left behind. In a month, they got to the British Army, 203,000 of them. 50,000 stayed behind in the mountains forever. Every Assyrian keeps a photograph of the patriarch Mar Shimon, who was killed in 1918, and since then the Assyrians became scattered themselves around the entire world. Russia and Georgia, Australia and the United States are now their homes. Their fathers have been born there, their children and grandchildren have been born there too. Life continues, and now nobody in Russia can stand in the way of Assyrians wishing to revive their culture, teach their children their language, and keep in contact with Assyrians of other countries.
آزاد قرمون خزدان خزداقلی دانم تیتلان ایران شانتاقلی افرروی خانی ایلانی ane qasri u bani kermani idmani nachad naidiyan ikel saman keli min diyan min khat akhchi رخ بدایو خز داید خینه اخنان بدرایو
I'm 66 years of age, and I'm very happy that I have lived to a time when national and religious policy has become more liberal, and it is even more popular now to be a believer. Nevertheless, even in Soviet times, we always celebrated our national holidays. Today, we are witnessing the construction of our Assyrian church of Matmari. I am happy that the day has come. In our faith, the church always has been a place to socialize. It is the cultural center of our community. Beginning with the people of my generation, we are going to pass more and more of our cultural and ethnic values onto our children. There's going to be a school and a library here. And there are plans to have a social club. We are going to celebrate our rituals and our holidays.
Здесь же будет библиотека, здесь будет школа, преподавать язык. Здесь еще какие-то мероприятия будут очень интересные.
I have been here for 2.5 years now, and my mission is to serve the Assyrians of Moscow and Russia, to celebrate and to administer the sacraments. I think that the beginning is always the most difficult part, but already there are good results showing. People are showing up, and I am very positive about the future of our congregation.
شيخ دور القديشة نطر لنبصلا وطوان نشتو تباغون ايهون نشتد نغزيك ليليهون وهركان السو من نغبة بيسون فوناي شيلافة
بركة المريب كل زونا بريخو يوم برمار كل دات وزادق عباد الشول
And maybe those within the Assyrian community who are calling for unification are the ones who will perhaps disprove the skeptics who predict that Assyrians will quickly assimilate after the breakup of the Soviet Union. If that process is inevitable, let it take as long as possible, so that there will remain among us those with the big and bottomless eyes that reflect all of the grandeur and fragility of a civilization.